Do you know what happens when arrogance mistakes dignity for weakness? The crystal chandeliers above the Grand Crescent Ballroom scattered warm light across polished marble floors, turning every champagne glass into a tiny star as the city's wealthiest families gathered beneath a ceiling painted with gold leaf and history. Waiters moved with practiced precision between round tables dressed in white linen. A string quartet filled the air with soft classical music, and camera flashes bounced from diamond necklaces worth more than most American homes. It was the annual Whitmore Legacy Gala, an invitation-only celebration where billion-dollar partnerships were expected to begin with elegant smiles and end with signatures that changed industries. Richard Whitmore stood at the center of it all, shaking hands with governors, CEOs, and investors who had traveled from New York, Chicago, Dallas, and Los Angeles. Tonight was supposed to secure the largest agreement in his company's history, a deal valued at $1 billion that would elevate Whitmore Holdings into an entirely different league. His daughter, Charlotte Whitmore, floated confidently through the ballroom in a custom ivory evening gown, accepting compliments as though they belonged to her by birthright. She had mastered the effortless confidence that came from never hearing the word no. Every smile she offered was carefully measured, every glance silently reminding others exactly where they ranked beneath her family name. Near the entrance, Aaliyah Brooks paused for only a second before stepping inside. Her midnight blue dress was elegant without demanding attention, her jewelry understated, her posture calm despite the sea of expensive tuxedos and designer gowns surrounding her. Most guests barely noticed her. Those who did assumed she was another event employee, perhaps someone assisting the organizers behind the scenes. That assumption had followed Aaliyah for years. It had taught her patience. It had taught her silence. And it had taught her never to measure a person's character by the labels other people placed upon them. She quietly accepted a glass of sparkling water from a passing server and observed the room with thoughtful eyes, noticing details most people ignored. Nervous executives rehearsing conversations under their breath, assistants adjusting presentation folders, security staff exchanging discreet signals through earpieces, and employees moving quickly to satisfy guests who never bothered learning their names. At the far end of the ballroom, a young black event coordinator accidentally brushed against Charlotte while carrying a tablet loaded with seating assignments. The contact was barely noticeable, but Charlotte stopped walking as though something offensive had happened. Conversations nearby softened. Heads slowly turned. The music continued, yet the atmosphere shifted almost instantly. The coordinator apologized with genuine sincerity, lowering her eyes for only a moment before preparing to continue her work. Charlotte's expression hardened instead of softening. Her voice, perfectly polished only seconds earlier, became cold enough to silence the laughter around her. Aaliyah watched from several yards away as guests pretended not to notice, each choosing comfort over courage. She felt the familiar weight of recognition settle in her chest. Some rooms were decorated with flowers and crystal, yet still managed to feel colder than winter. She took one quiet breath, set her untouched glass onto a silver tray, and began walking toward the growing circle of silence, unaware that within the next few moments one decision would erase a billion-dollar future before a single contract could ever be signed. Aaliyah Brooks slowed her steps as the circle of onlookers widened almost without anyone realizing it. The young event coordinator stood frozen beside an overturned folder of seating cards that had slipped onto the polished marble floor. Several guests glanced toward the scene, then quickly looked away, choosing conversations about stock prices, vacation homes, and charitable foundations instead. It was remarkable how easily silence became acceptable when the person standing alone had no obvious power. Aaliyah recognized that silence. She had lived through it before. Years earlier, she had been the youngest senior risk analyst at one of the most respected investment firms in the country, trusted to evaluate companies whose values mattered just as much as their financial statements. She had spent countless nights reviewing compliance reports, leadership records, and ethical audits because experience had taught her a simple truth. Financial numbers could predict profits, but character predicted whether those profits would last. When her mother became seriously ill, Aaliyah left the career she loved without complaint, trading executive boardrooms for years spent as a full-time caregiver. After her mother's passing, She discovered that employment gaps often erased accomplishments in the eyes of recruiters. Interviews became shorter. Opportunities quietly disappeared. People noticed her skin before they noticed her resume. They noticed her simple clothing before they noticed the graduate degree hanging carefully framed in her apartment. Eventually, she stopped trying to explain herself to strangers who had already decided who she was. What very few people inside the ballroom understood was that Aaliyah had not attended the gala hoping to impress anyone. Earlier that afternoon, she had received a confidential invitation from Ellison Capital, the investment firm preparing to finalize the billion-dollar partnership with Whitmore Holdings. Instead of announcing their final approval publicly, the firm's chairwoman had requested one last independent ethics observation. The assignment was unusual but intentional. Financial strength had already been verified. Leadership character had not. Aaliyah accepted because she believed integrity revealed itself most clearly when powerful people believed nobody important was watching. She had arrived early, quietly checked in under a confidential guest designation, and agreed not to introduce herself unless necessary. Even Richard Whitmore had no idea an independent ethics consultant was already inside the ballroom. Across the room, Charlotte continued speaking with effortless confidence, while assistants hurried to satisfy every request before it was fully spoken. One employee adjusted floral arrangements for the third time. Another replaced a champagne flute simply because. The reflection looked imperfect beneath the chandelier. Every detail revolved around appearances. Aaliyah noticed something else. The event coordinator was apologizing repeatedly for an accident that required only a simple smile and reassurance. Instead, embarrassment continued growing with every passing second. Aaliyah felt an old memory return, hearing her late mother quietly remind her that respect cost nothing yet remained the rarest gift in wealthy rooms. She walked closer, calm and unhurried, offering the young woman a gentle smile before kneeling to gather the scattered seating cards from the floor. Several nearby guests exchanged puzzled looks. None recognized Aaliyah. None understood why a woman carrying herself with quiet confidence seemed completely unconcerned with social status. They only watched as she handed the neatly organized cards back to the grateful coordinator, then rose gracefully to her feet, just as Charlotte Whitmore slowly turned and noticed her for the very first time. Charlotte Whitmore studied Aaliyah with the kind of measured expression that had made countless employees second-guess themselves before she ever spoke a word. The ballroom lights shimmered across polished silver and crystal, yet the warmth seemed to disappear from the air surrounding their small circle. Richard Whitmore continued greeting investors only a short distance away, unaware that the evening's most important moment was unfolding far from the stage where speeches would soon begin. Charlotte glanced briefly at the event coordinator, then back to Aaliyah, her smile perfectly composed but completely devoid of kindness. "Those are staff materials," she said evenly. "Our employees know how to handle their own responsibilities." Aaliyah met her eyes without hostility. "She dropped them by accident," she replied softly. "It only took a few seconds to help." A faint murmur drifted through nearby guests. The response was calm, respectful, and impossible to criticize. Yet Charlotte's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. She was accustomed to immediate agreement, not quiet confidence. Around them, conversation slowed as executives pretended to admire paintings or sip sparkling water while discreetly listening. Charlotte folded her hands in front of her. "This is a private gala," she continued. "Everyone here represents someone important." The words carried an unmistakable implication. Aaliyah understood it immediately. She had heard versions of the same sentence throughout her life, spoken differently, but always meaning exactly the same thing. She answered with the same steady composure. "Everyone represents someone important," she said. "Sometimes they simply are not introduced properly." One elderly board member lifted his eyebrows before looking away. Another guest quietly lowered his champagne glass onto a nearby tray. The silence began stretching through the ballroom like invisible thread. Across the room, the string quartet transitioned into another classical piece, their music floating gently beneath the growing tension. Richard Whitmore finally noticed that several influential investors were no longer watching the stage. Their attention had shifted toward Charlotte. He excused himself from a conversation and started walking across the ballroom, accompanied by two senior executives. At nearly the same moment, A hotel manager hurried toward the event coordinator with visible concern, whispering an apology and assuring her everything would be corrected. The young woman looked relieved, but she continued clutching the stack of seating cards with trembling hands. Aaliyah noticed the nervousness immediately. She offered the coordinator a reassuring smile that quietly settled her breathing. It was a small gesture, almost invisible among so much luxury, yet several guests noticed it. Character often revealed itself in moments too ordinary for headlines. Charlotte noticed it as well, but interpreted it differently. To her, Aaliyah's calmness looked less like kindness and more like defiance. She took one deliberate step closer, lowering her voice enough that only those nearest could hear. "Confidence is admirable," Charlotte said, "provided it is earned." Aaliyah remained completely still. The chandelier above reflected softly across the marble floor between them, creating the strange illusion that they stood on opposite sides of the same light. Before Aaliyah could answer, Richard Whitmore reached the edge of the gathering with a practiced smile, unaware that the next few moments would reveal far more about his family's future than any billion-dollar presentation waiting behind the ballroom doors. Richard Whitmore arrived with the polished confidence of a man who believed every problem could be resolved with the right smile and the right handshake. He greeted several guests as he approached, unaware that dozens of quiet eyes were now following him instead of the illuminated stage where the evening's presentation would soon begin. "Charlotte," he said pleasantly, "is everything all right?" His daughter answered before anyone else could speak. "Everything is under control. Someone simply forgot where she belongs." The words floated through the ballroom with surprising clarity. A few conversations stopped altogether. Aaliyah remained composed, her hands resting naturally at her sides. She had spent enough years inside executive meetings to recognize when emotions were being used to establish authority rather than solve problems. Richard offered Aaliyah a courteous but distant smile, assuming she was another guest who had wandered into an uncomfortable misunderstanding. "I hope there has been no inconvenience," he said. "Our gala can become rather busy before the main announcement." Before Aaliyah could respond, the young event coordinator stepped forward with visible hesitation. "Sir," she said quietly, "she only helped me pick up the seating cards." Richard nodded politely without looking directly at the coordinator. "Very well. Then let us all enjoy the evening." It should have ended there. Most people would have accepted the graceful exit. Aaliyah almost did. Then she noticed something that instantly drew her attention. One of Charlotte's assistants hurried across the ballroom carrying a thin black portfolio stamped with the silver logo of Ellison Capital. As he reached the presentation table, a single document slipped partially from the folder before he quickly pushed it back inside. The movement lasted barely a second, yet Aaliyah recognized the page immediately. It was not the investment agreement itself. It was the ethics certification attached to the final approval package. Her years in corporate risk analysis had trained her eyes to notice details other people dismissed. She quietly studied the signatures visible along the lower margin. One space remained intentionally blank, the approval line reserved for the independent ethics reviewer. Aaliyah understood exactly what that meant. Ellison Capital had not finalized anything. They were still watching. They were still evaluating. And everything happening inside the ballroom still mattered. She lifted her eyes toward Richard. "Before your presentation begins," she said gently, "I hope everyone remembers that partnerships are built long before contracts are signed." Richard looked mildly puzzled. "I appreciate the sentiment," he replied, offering a diplomatic smile. "Our company has spent decades building trust." Aaliyah nodded respectfully. Trust is rarely measured during prepared speeches. It is usually measured during unexpected moments. A subtle change crossed Richard's face. The sentence lingered longer than he expected. Several executives nearby exchanged uncertain glances, sensing that the conversation had shifted into unfamiliar territory. Charlotte, however, interpreted Aaliyah's calm observation as another challenge. Her patience, already wearing thin, finally began giving way to irritation. She stepped forward once more, determined to end the exchange before another guest could question her authority. Around them, crystal glasses reflected the warm chandelier light, while the string quartet continued playing with quiet elegance, unaware that the music was becoming little more than a backdrop to a decision that would soon determine the future of everyone gathered inside the Grand Crescent Ballroom. Charlotte's polished smile disappeared completely. The quiet confidence standing before her felt less like humility now and more like an unwelcome challenge to the order she believed everyone should respect. Around them, conversations had faded into careful whispers. Executives who had spent decades negotiating mergers suddenly found themselves watching an exchange that no financial report could predict. Richard Whitmore sensed the growing discomfort and attempted to redirect the evening with practiced diplomacy. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said warmly, "our presentation will begin in just a few minutes." But Charlotte was no longer listening. Her attention remained fixed on Aaliyah. "You seem very interested in how this company operates," she said, her voice carrying farther than she intended. "Tell me, who exactly invited you?" Aaliyah answered without hesitation. "I was invited to observe the evening." Charlotte gave a short laugh that drew a few uncertain smiles from guests who were unsure whether they were expected to join her. "Observe," she repeated. "From which department? Catering? Hospitality? Security?" The young event coordinator lowered her eyes, clearly hoping the conversation would end. Several hotel employees quietly stopped moving altogether. Aaliyah did not react to the mockery. "Titles matter less than choices," she replied gently. "People often reveal themselves before introductions are ever necessary." Charlotte took another slow step forward. "You speak as though your opinion belongs in this room." Aaliyah's expression remained calm. Every action becomes someone's opinion eventually. The sentence landed with surprising weight. Richard glanced briefly towards several investors standing nearby. None of them were smiling anymore. One senior executive from Whitmore Holdings adjusted his tie with visible uneasiness. Another discreetly checked his phone before slipping it back into his pocket. The atmosphere had changed. It no longer felt like a celebration. It felt like an invisible evaluation. Charlotte, however, mistook the silence for support. "People spend years earning a place beside families like ours," she continued. "Respect is not something you simply walk in and claim." Aaliyah looked toward the nervous event coordinator, who still stood clutching the stack of seating cards against her chest. "Respect is not claimed," she answered quietly. "It is given freely or withheld by choice." For a brief moment, nobody spoke. Even the musicians seemed quieter beneath the soaring ceiling. Crystal glasses reflected warm amber light, while dozens of guests stood perfectly still, sensing that something important was unfolding without fully understanding why. Charlotte's frustration finally overcame her restraint. She dismissed Aaliyah with a sharp wave of her hand, a gesture that accidentally knocked the untouched glass of sparkling water from a nearby silver tray. The glass slipped to the marble floor and shattered with a crisp echo that cut through the ballroom like a bell. Every conversation stopped instantly. Security personnel turned toward the sound. Hotel staff hurried forward with towels and cleaning equipment. Charlotte looked at the broken glass, then back at Aaliyah, her expression filled with unmistakable contempt. "This is exactly why people should stay in the places they belong," she declared loudly enough for the surrounding guests to hear. A heavy silence settled across the ballroom. Aaliyah neither stepped backward nor answered immediately. She simply looked around the room, meeting the eyes of people who had witnessed everything yet said nothing. Far beyond the gathering, unnoticed by almost everyone present, a large display screen near the presentation stage quietly illuminated as an incoming secure video connection from Ellison Capital began requesting authorization to join the evening's ceremony. The sharp sound of broken glass faded, leaving behind a silence so complete that even the string quartet slowly lowered their bows. No one hurried to fill the emptiness with conversation. No one laughed. The ballroom, moments earlier overflowing with effortless confidence, suddenly felt strangely fragile beneath its glittering chandeliers. Hotel staff carefully swept away the shattered pieces while guests remained perfectly still, each pretending to study something else, but unable to look away from the quiet figure standing at the center of the room. Aaliyah glanced briefly at the sparkling fragments scattered across the marble floor. Tiny reflections shimmered beneath the golden light like broken stars. She had learned long ago that pride often made the loudest noise, while dignity rarely needed to raise its voice. The young event coordinator stepped closer. Her eyes filled with worry. "I am so sorry," she whispered. "This happened because I dropped those cards." Aaliyah offered her the same reassuring smile she had worn from the beginning of the evening. "No," she answered gently. Accidents happen. What matters is how people choose to respond afterward. The young woman nodded, taking a slow breath as some of the tension finally left her shoulders. Nearby, several employees exchanged quiet glances. They had witnessed hundreds of elegant galas over the years, but very few moments where kindness seemed stronger than status. Richard Whitmore stood motionless, his attention shifting between his daughter and the growing discomfort spreading across the faces of investors. Something inside him felt unexpectedly unsettled. The evening was no longer following the script his team had spent months preparing. Around the ballroom, expensive watches continued ticking toward the scheduled presentation, yet nobody seemed interested in checking the time anymore. Charlotte folded her arms, convinced that silence meant victory. She expected Aaliyah to leave, embarrassed or discouraged like so many others before her. Instead, Aaliyah simply stepped aside to give the cleaning staff room to finish their work. She thanked one employee for replacing the damaged tray, then quietly straightened a chair that had been bumped during the commotion. The simple gestures stood in remarkable contrast to the luxury surrounding them. Several guests noticed. One elderly woman sitting near the stage slowly lowered her program onto the table and continued watching with thoughtful eyes. A retired federal judge quietly whispered something to the investor beside him before both men looked toward Richard with expressions that had become impossible to ignore. At the far end of the ballroom, the enormous presentation screen brightened again. A soft notification tone echoed through the room. One of Whitmore Holdings' technical directors frowned as he looked down at his tablet. "Sir," he called carefully toward Richard, "we have an encrypted live connection requesting immediate access to the main presentation system." Richard turned instinctively. "Who is requesting it?" The technician checked the authorization twice before answering. His voice sounded noticeably smaller than before. "Ellison Capital Executive Office." A subtle ripple moved through the crowd. Several investors exchanged surprised looks. The scheduled video conference was not supposed to begin for another 30 minutes. Richard adjusted his jacket and forced a confident smile, believing the unexpected connection probably signaled good news. He had no way of knowing that while the ballroom still sparkled with crystal, gold, and polished marble, the true evaluation of everyone inside had already begun long before the first business presentation ever reached the screen. The ballroom lights dimmed automatically as the massive presentation screen came to life. Quiet conversations disappeared completely. Every guest turned toward the glowing display where the silver crest of Ellison Capital slowly appeared against a deep blue background. Richard Whitmore straightened his jacket and smiled with renewed confidence. This was the moment he had spent nearly a year preparing for. He glanced proudly toward Charlotte, silently reassuring her that everything was once again under control. Across the room, Aaliyah remained where she was, hands gently folded, her expression unchanged. She did not move closer to the stage. She did not attempt to explain herself. She simply watched. After a brief pause, the screen shifted to reveal Eleanor Ellison, the chairwoman of Ellison Capital. Her calm voice filled the ballroom with effortless authority. "Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us." Applause began politely before fading away. Eleanor smiled warmly, but her eyes carried the focus of someone who rarely overlooked details. "Before our firm authorizes the final investment," she continued, "there was one remaining condition that required completion tonight." Richard nodded confidently. "Of course," he replied. "Our team has prepared everything requested." Eleanor inclined her head slightly. "I know. Financial reports were excellent. Operational reviews exceeded expectations. Legal compliance has already been approved." A ripple of relief moved through several Whitmore executives. Then Eleanor continued speaking. "The final review was never about numbers." The room became still again. Richard's smile faltered almost imperceptibly. "Every investment of this size," Eleanor explained, "includes an independent ethics evaluation. We believe leadership is revealed most clearly during ordinary interactions rather than formal presentations." Several guests exchanged uncertain glances. Charlotte looked toward her father, suddenly unsure why the conversation felt different than expected. Eleanor looked down briefly at a document resting on her desk before lifting her eyes back toward the camera. "Our independent evaluator has been present throughout this evening." A long silence followed. Richard slowly turned toward his executive team, expecting someone to identify the consultant. Nobody moved. Eleanor spoke once more. Ms. Aaliyah Brooks, would you please join us? Hundreds of eyes shifted at once. The movement swept across the ballroom like a single wave before stopping on the woman standing quietly near the edge of the marble floor. The young event coordinator covered her mouth in disbelief. Hotel employees froze where they stood. Richard stared at Aaliyah, unable to reconcile the composed woman before him with the confidential evaluator he had never expected to meet. Charlotte's confident posture disappeared. Her expression emptied as realization slowly replaced certainty. Aaliyah walked forward without haste, her footsteps soft against the polished marble. She stopped beneath the chandelier where the warm light reflected gently across the room. Eleanor smiled through the screen. Ms. Brooks has advised our firm on executive ethics assessments for several years. Her recommendations have protected both investors and communities by identifying leadership risks that financial statements cannot measure. No one spoke. The silence felt heavier than any speech that evening. Eleanor looked directly into the camera. Ms. Brooks, she asked calmly, based on everything you observed tonight, does Whitmore Holdings meet Ellison Capital's leadership standards required for final approval? Richard felt every heartbeat echo. Inside the silent ballroom, Charlotte lowered her eyes for the first time that evening. The billion-dollar agreement no longer depended on contracts, presentations, or market forecasts. It depended entirely on the answer of the woman nearly everyone in the room had failed to truly see. Aaliyah allowed the silence to settle before answering. She looked first at Eleanor Ellison on the screen, then slowly across the ballroom. Her eyes rested briefly on the young event coordinator, who still held the stack of seating cards against her chest, and then on the hotel employees who had quietly kept the evening running while remaining almost invisible to the guests they served. Finally, she looked at Richard Whitmore. His confident posture had softened into uncertainty, and for the first time all evening he appeared less like the powerful chairman of a global company and more like a man waiting to hear an honest truth. Eleanor spoke gently. Ms. Brooks, your recommendation will determine whether we proceed. Aaliyah nodded once. Ellison Capital asked me to evaluate leadership, not profitability, she said calmly. Financial strength is easy to measure. Character is not. Every word echoed clearly through the ballroom. Nobody interrupted. Tonight, I observed extraordinary organization, impressive planning, and remarkable operational discipline. I also observed something else. I watched people with authority overlook those whose work made this evening possible. I watched fear silence good employees. I watched dignity answered with contempt instead of respect. Charlotte lowered her eyes toward the marble floor. The confidence that had surrounded her all evening seemed to dissolve beneath the weight of Aaliyah's words. Richard slowly removed his glasses and held them quietly in one hand. Aaliyah continued without anger. Leadership is revealed in ordinary moments. When someone spills a drink, when an employee makes a mistake, when a stranger offers help, those moments cannot be rehearsed because they reveal who we already are. Eleanor remained silent, allowing every sentence to reach the room without interruption. Richard took one careful step forward. Ms. Brooks, he said sincerely, if we failed your evaluation, then I failed as the leader of this company. I spent years building a business while assuming our culture reflected my intentions. Tonight, I learned intentions are meaningless if they are not visible in everyday actions. The ballroom remained completely still. Charlotte slowly looked toward the young event coordinator. Her voice was barely above a whisper. I owe you an apology. She turned toward Aaliyah next. And I owe you one as well. I judged you before I knew anything about you. I believed status mattered more than character. I was wrong. The apology was simple. It contained no excuses and no attempt to protect her pride. Aaliyah studied both father and daughter for a long moment before answering. An apology matters only when it becomes a different way of treating people tomorrow. Richard nodded immediately. Then tomorrow begins tonight. He turned toward the employees gathered around the ballroom. Every member of our staff deserves the same respect as every executive in this room. That changes now. Eleanor finally smiled. Thank you, Mr. Whitmore. Ms. Brooks, based on everything you have witnessed, would you like to amend your recommendation? Aaliyah drew one slow breath. I cannot recommend approving a partnership based on promises alone, she answered. But I can recommend postponing the decision long enough for genuine change to be demonstrated. Character can improve when humility becomes real. Eleanor inclined her head with quiet approval. Then the agreement will be delayed pending a new review. Relief mixed with reflection spread across the ballroom. The investment had not been lost forever, but everyone understood that its future would now depend not on wealth or influence, but on whether the lessons of this remarkable evening would truly become part of Whitmore Holdings. 3 months later, the first light of an autumn morning settled gently across the glass towers of Whitmore Holdings, replacing the glitter of the gala with something quieter and far more meaningful. Employees entered through the front lobby carrying coffee cups, laptops, and conversations that no longer stopped when executives walked past. Fresh flowers rested beside the reception desk, sunlight reflected across polished stone, and a new bronze plaque stood near the entrance. It did not celebrate revenue, acquisitions, or market value. It simply read, "Leadership begins with respect." Visitors paused to read it before continuing toward the elevators. Many smiled without realizing why. Inside the executive conference room, Richard Whitmore stood beside a presentation screen, not introducing quarterly earnings, but a completely redesigned leadership program requiring every executive, including himself, to spend time working alongside frontline employees throughout the company. Customer service representatives, maintenance staff, receptionists, security officers, and hospitality teams would now participate in leadership discussions previously reserved only for senior management. The policy surprised many investors at first, yet over the following weeks employee retention improved, customer satisfaction reached record levels, and the culture inside the company began changing in ways that could never be measured by a spreadsheet alone. Charlotte changed as well. She quietly volunteered with organizations that supported career development for young professionals from underserved communities, never requesting publicity or recognition. She learned people's names before discussing their positions. She listened more than she spoke. The transformation happened slowly, one ordinary conversation at a time, proving that humility was not born from embarrassment, but from choosing differently every day afterward. On a crisp Friday afternoon, Eleanor Ellison returned to Whitmore Holdings for the final evaluation. There were no grand celebrations, no orchestra, and no cameras waiting for dramatic announcements. She spent hours speaking privately with employees across every department, asking simple questions about respect, trust, and daily leadership. Late that afternoon, she signed the final approval. The investment moved forward, not because the company had become perfect, but because it had shown the courage to change when confronted with an uncomfortable truth. Before leaving the building, Eleanor met Aaliyah Brooks in the lobby. They exchanged a quiet handshake beneath the warm afternoon sunlight pouring through the glass entrance. "You were right," Eleanor said softly. "Character deserves the final signature." Aaliyah smiled with the same calm warmth she had carried from the beginning. "People can surprise us," she replied. "Sometimes the greatest investment is giving someone the opportunity to become better." As she stepped outside, a cool breeze carried golden leaves across the sidewalk. Office workers hurried past, unaware that months earlier a single evening inside those walls had changed the future of an entire company. Aaliyah paused only once before walking toward the city street. Behind her, the building reflected the fading sunlight like polished gold, but she never looked back. She did not need to. Some victories are not measured by money, applause, or headlines. They are measured by quieter things, a respectful greeting, an open door, a sincere apology, and a choice to see another human being with equal dignity. The evening had never truly been about a billion-dollar agreement. It had always been about the priceless value of character. And long after the contracts were signed and the lights inside the tower dimmed for the night, that lesson remained, carried not by speeches, but by the quiet justice of people who finally learned that kindness is never weakness, and respect is the strongest legacy anyone can leave behind.